Hi everyone, so my name is Deborah Coz. I'm a PhD student in geography in Montpellier in southern France, where I study both wild boars on the one hand and common cranes on the other hand. But I'll be talking here about a project that was led by Raphaël Matevé and Simon Chamaye-Jam, who are both researchers as well in Montpellier. And I was an intern at the time a few years ago. They unfortunately could not be here, so I'll happily do the talking. So the issues when it comes to wild boars are usually quite well known, so I won't go into too many details. We have growing numbers of wild boars in France as in other parts of Europe, which is often associated with damages to crops, collisions on the roads, swine fever, so it's a species that is often considered as problematic. On the other hand, it's one of the main game species nowadays in France, so it's also a valuable game species for the hunters. And this overall has led to tensions for a long time, or conflicts between hunters and farmers historically. And the main response to these conflicts and to the damages is an intense hunting pressure, as well as damage compensation schemes. And you have to bear in mind that in France, the damages are being paid by the hunters to the farmers. But one of the issues that we have now is that there are fewer hunters. It's also quite a controversial activity, not so much when it comes to wild boars, who don't arouse a lot of sympathy, but in general. So the hunters are under a lot of financial pressure, and they also feel pressured socially, which obviously contributes to the conflicts. And what we also have now are conflicts between hunters, farmers, as well as managers of protected areas or private landowners who do not hunt at all or hunt very little on their grounds. And so there's this idea among hunters that protected areas or the areas that are less or not hunted are refuges for wild boars during the hunting period. So we have conflicts between humans around these species, but also controversies. And what I mean by that is that there are lots of debates regarding knowledge on wild boar behavior, the movements of wild boars, and who's legitimate to produce and own that knowledge, with hunters being adamant that they know everything about wild boars and that they have the solutions for managing and regulating the population. So there was actually in the area that I'm going to talk about a demand from the protected area managers to collect more data on these wild boar movements and to mitigate the conflict, which led to this scientific program that took place between 2019 and is still a little ongoing, to first map the conflicts, map the stakeholders, the issues, as well as collect data on wild boar movements. And finally, to facilitate dialogue and cooperation between the different stakeholders. The idea was to use the maps of wild boar movements as boundary objects to foster dialogue between the different stakeholders, between academics and non-academics as well. So the project took place in two areas, one in the Alps, the National Park of the Écrins, and the Gorges du Gardon. In the interest of time, of course, I won't be going into the detail of both case studies. I'll focus on the Gorges du Gardon, which is a UNESCO biosphere reserve in southern France, with a diversity of landscapes and land uses, mainly a big urban area in the south, which is the city of Nîmes. And then north of this area, scrubland and forests, and then again north of this area, wide agricultural areas where the crop damage occur. And within this biosphere reserve, there are several small areas that are protected for Bonelli's eagle, and which were considered at the time by the hunters as refuge areas for the wild boars, with a shorter hunting period in this area. So they considered that it prevented them from properly regulating the population and preventing damage. So in order to understand what was going on, we mixed ecology and social sciences, and mainly geography. So on the one hand, there were ecological studies to test that reserve effect in the protected areas with camera trapping and GPS collaring. So 29 camera traps were put at the boundaries of the protected areas to observe wild boars coming in and out, and we also had 26 wild boars equipped with GPS collars. And to go straight to the point, it showed no evidence that wild boars perceive these protected areas as refuge areas and that they use them preferentially. Here you can see three of the three protected areas for Barnley's eagle, and all the dots are the collection of all the locations that we got from the GPS collars. And so, yeah, the wild boars were not particularly using this area, so apparently no refuge effect here. But obviously we lack a lot of information with these little dots. We don't know so much about what the wild boars do in between, where they go, why, and so on, which is why we also wanted to complement that with social sciences and insights from the local stakeholders, which led to these interviews with hunters and hunting organizations, interviews with farmers and farming organizations as well, workshops with the different stakeholders, and other meetings with the hunters only, the farmers only, to better understand the situation and understand the issues at the time, as well as reflect on potential future management actions. And here still, so hunting was still seen as the main response that could be provided. They also highlighted the fact that it would be interesting to change the damage compensation scheme. And finally, the idea was to enable all the different stakeholders to reflect on their own knowledge of wild boars and wild boar movements, and finally bring additional information to these different perspectives and to the ecological results. And so in order to go a little bit beyond that, we actually started doing other interviews in 2021, where we used aerial images to elicit this local knowledge, mostly with hunters at the time, and simulate wild boar movements. So the people were actually asked to imagine themselves as wild boars going in the landscape and imagine where they would go and so on. And this actually showed that there were very, very different perceptions and representations of wild boar movements. They were all asked to start from the same starting point in the landscape, and you can see that on the left the person imagined wild boars moving in a very, very small area, whereas on the right the person imagined the wild boar moving in a much larger landscape. So this was a way to highlight that they all have very different perceptions and representations of wild boar movements and habitat use. And it was also a way to reflect on very specific situations, such as drive hunts, which obviously do not necessarily appear on the ecological data that we gathered from the GPS collars. And so here you have the hunter thinking again about the movements that wild boars do in these particular situations. And it was also a way to think about individual behaviors and how they might differ from one individual to another, which is again very little taken into account in ecological studies, where they do a lot of models that tend to hide these individual behaviors. And then the final method that we are still trying to develop is a serious game to gather these different perspectives and foster again the dialogue between the different stakeholders and discuss collectively on population dynamics, management actions, and to explicit these decision-making processes. So it's still very much a work in progress, but the idea is to use these serious games, which are now quite popular in when dealing with conservation issues or resource management issues. And the idea is to bring people with different perspectives around the table and have them exchange their roles, so that the hunter, for instance, will adopt the perspective of the farmer and so on. And here, one of the things that we're trying to do is to also include the wild boar's perspective and the movement, all this knowledge that we gathered regarding wild boar behavior, to see how it can influence the mediation process and be included in this process. And so that's still very much, we're still trying to, we haven't tested it with local hunters yet, we've done it with academics only, so it's still, again, a work in progress, but we're hopeful that it will work. And so what has been achieved with this project is that we've managed to combine perspectives from different stakeholders and also disciplines. It's not always easy to interact, for ecologists to interact with social scientists and the other way around. These workshops, these GPS tracks and the pictures that we used have enabled both academics as well as non-academics and all the different stakeholders to learn things about wild boars, as you can see from the two quotes here. And so combining these different perspectives was a way to work towards more objective information and learn again more things about wild boar behavior and movements. And finally, we've managed to full-time build trust and dialogue between the different local stakeholders. But this only lasted for a while. It was a response to an acute conflict at a very specific moment. After that, there was a lot of turnover among the different managers, especially among the hunters, but also among the protected area managers, who also had other priorities as the situation calmed down. And as far as we researchers were concerned, as you probably know, we are in this very short-term projects where at some point we have to switch to another project, so we sort of left the scene. And the local managers did not take over and include these wild boar issue into a wider dialogue within this area. And finally, it was extremely difficult to include the hunting organizations at a higher level, who are still adamant that they know everything and that they have the solutions to the issue. So we managed to resolve or transform the conflict at a very local scale, but at some point it doesn't resist this higher political pressure. So this really is a challenge. And finally, as I touched on, intense hunting remains the main management process, and obviously we'd like to see if we can do differently. It's not a species that attracts a lot of sympathy, but there are probably other ways to deal with this, and so these different questions and approaches are still under questioning, and we're trying to develop this in other contexts, but I think it's time for me to leave the floor. So yeah, thank you very much for your attention, and if you have any questions.
Really interesting. Thanks, Deborah. I want to ask, for your serious games and some of that role-playing stuff, was it difficult to get people to, what they thought was a serious issue, to buy into that kind of, well, I guess a more playful or that kind of gaming scenario? Was that hard to get?
So for this particular case study, we haven't really started doing it with the local stakeholders. We've only tested it with academics, so I don't really have any insights into that. We usually don't invite them to say we're going to play a game because they always have better things to do. But I have a little experience on other case studies, and they usually, I mean, it's quite a tricky thing. They're usually quite interested, and it's a nice way to, for a time, be in a sort of playful atmosphere and calm the conflict down. But they're also trying to adopt a different posture, and so I don't know, I haven't enough experience with the serious games to tell you whether that really works, but we'll see in a few months.
One more question, real quick.
Hi. My question is about the reserve effect that you were mentioning that is not really happening.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
The reserve effect, that the wild boars were not concentrating. Do you have any idea why? Or is just because the hunting pressure is not that intense in the surrounding? Or
I think, well, in this particular case study, it's mainly because the landscape is not so different in the area, so they don't have any specific reason to go there. In the other case study, the Écrins National Park, you really have a protected area with mainly forests, so where they do find refuge, and all the agricultural areas are outside the protected areas, so there is indeed this effect, but it's mainly because of the landscape characteristics. It doesn't really have to do with the protection status. So, yeah.
thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.